John Gill, how this man changed bouldering forever. So there's this small community in the 1950s to 1960s, around 10,000-ish people, who do a lot of weird stuff on rocks and rock faces, rock climbing and bouldering. And amongst these people, there's a person named John Gill, and he's about to change bouldering forever. Wait, what does that, even mean? So let's slow down a bit. So it's 1937 in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and then suddenly, boom, baby John Gill is born. And now, John Gill lives in a couple of cities after he's born in Alabama, and generally around the southeastern part of United States. And he might not know it yet, but he's about to be one of the biggest and influential person in bouldering. Bouldering? What is bouldering? I thought that was rock climbing.
Bouldering, as a noun, is the sport or activity of climbing on boulders no taller than 20 feet, or 6.1 meters. In an interview by The Short Span, they asked John Gill, how would you define bouldering? John Gill responded with, the way that I did in the 1950s, one-pitch climbing of great difficulty, usually done close to the ground and unroped. I also felt a bouldering problem should have some kind of dynamic component.
John Gill is the father of modern bouldering. From his revolutionary ideas and technique, he pioneered a new understanding of what we call bouldering. He changed the thought that bouldering is just a subdivision of rock climbing and made it its own unique sport. From his right to move freely and his freedom of expression, to the responsibility of shaping and leading a brand new community of boulders, he started from high school and onto his greatest achievements, and finally, his retirement. He still remains an influential part of bouldering. Now, let's explore his past from start to finish.
In 1937, World War II was still on the rage. This time was stained with the association of conflict and disaster, but at least there was some innovation. It was a stressful time period. A natural gas explosion causes the death of over 300 students in Texas. Blues singer Bessie Smith gets killed in a car wreck.
But I guess there was the invention of the electric guitar, so I guess it evens out.
Amongst this, however, baby John Gill was born on February 16th and growing up in Tuscaloosa in the state of Alabama. There really wasn't a lot of information about John Gill during this time. However, bouldering really wasn't much at the time. Bouldering was thought of a subdivision of rock climbing, usually just used to practice for longer, more harder climbs. Skipping ahead to the 1950s, it's 1950, and young John Gill has now entered high school. He's a freshman in Bass High School in Atlanta, Georgia. Life in the 1950s was an era to behold. TVs has just gotten cheap enough for regular families to buy. We also saw the birth of classic TV shows like I Love Lucky and Twilight Zone. This was around the time the boom of the space race was in full swing. World War II had just ended and people were moving to the suburbs. Along with that, they popularized the civil rights movement. We also saw the emergence of rock and roll. Although there was a lot of excitement and innovation, there were still wars such as the Cold War between Russia and the USA and the Korean War. All of this does not stop John, however, as he enters the gymnastic team. As an amateur gymnast in the 1950s, John was always a competitive person. He was able to climb a 20-foot rope in just 3.4 seconds. To put that into perspective, the record at the time was 2.8 seconds. He was really into gymnastics. He can do introverted and Olympic crosses. He was also able to do giant swings.
But gymnastics wasn't the only thing John Gill had discovered. And by the time he was 16, he was already into climbing, specifically bouldering. When he graduated high school, he was already doing exercises exceeding modern standards.
The exercises John Gill was able to do included half a dozen one-arm pull-ups, a few one-finger one-arm pull-ups, and one-arm front lever, just to name a few. Around the same time in 1954, John Gill was one, if not the first person to start using gym chalk when rock climbing and or bouldering. Gym chalk and bouldering? Gym chalk was one of the very important things that John Gill had added to bouldering.
Chalk is very important because it helps dries out your hands and it improves your grip.
John had the ability to experiment how he wanted to move around, so he did. I think that's pretty awesome. Gill had understood that gymnasts often use chalk to help prevent them from slipping from bars, rings, etc. So he implemented it into bouldering, which is pretty smart. John Gill usually had access to chalk because he was in the gymnastics team, and he implemented that into bouldering very well. But chalk wasn't the only thing John had added into bouldering. You see here, John Gill thought differently. Instead of just trying to get on top of a boulder, he only thought a boulder was really completed when it can be done with grace. In the early 1950s to 60s, climbing was still just thought of an extension of walking, but John said no. Instead, he said that climbing was an extension of gymnastics. He said, quote, "If you have a boulder, you can treat it like an apparatus, and you can do routines on it." Mr. Gill didn't simply boulder for the practice of harder rock climbs. Mr. Gill, he bouldered and promoted it as its own unique sport. Gill starts Georgia Tech in 1954 and graduates in 1956 with his master's degree. In 1958, John Gill had entered the U.S. Air Force Reserves as a second lieutenant. John Gill explains how the Air Force treated him well, and he ended up sticking with the program. A little while after, he graduated from the University of Georgia with a degree in mathematics. Almost immediately after, he entered the University of Chicago for the Special Graduate Meteorology program. In 1959, John gets out of the program. And just when the decade is just about to come to an end, John Gill did something incredible. He had just completed Gill's problem, a climb so hard many have tried but failed. This climb raised new standards in climbing difficulty. Gill's problem was one of the first 5.108 climbs in the entirety of America, and John Gill had just completed it. That was only one of his many accomplishments. John Gill went out to do a lot more stuff during the 1960s. He completed the boulder climb final exam in 1960. He resigned from the Air Force in October of 1962 as a captain. Somewhere in the mid-1960s, he completed the boulder Gill's Crack. He got his master's degree in the University of Alabama in 1964. He became an instructor at Murray State University from 1964 till 1967, when he enrolled in Colorado State University as a graduate student in the same year. He received his PhD in classical complex analysis in 1971. Along with these achievements, one thing stood out. One thing he did was so revolutionary, it pushed the expectations for bouldering and climbing forever, making the whole community's jaw drop. John Gill had just scaled Thimble Overhang. A climb so difficult it took 20 years for it to be recreated. How did he do it? John Gill was a junior in high school. His first ever climb was Fort Mountain in North Georgia. Originally, he was just accompanying his friend to the mountainside to help his friend with some research. They dangled on limestone cliffs, and this is where John completed his first ever rappel. He said, quote, "I was hooked on this strange activity. This is where it all starts." A year later, he was fully into bouldering. He was climbing Stone Mountain and even his campus walls. He would exercise 2 to 3 times a week. He would eat meals that are high in protein and take vitamin pills. All this training and knowledge allowed John Gill to climb Thimble Overhang. Although Thimble Overhang was considered the hardest climb John completed, he described his favorite climb being Gill's Problem and the other boulders surrounding Jenny Lake. He said, "I recall when I made Gill's Problem on Red Cross Rocks in 1959. I told the climbing rangers about it and it left them more or less speechless." In 1978, John Gill completes the Groove. He is no longer climbing competitively as there are new climbers exceeding his performance. Finally, he retires in the 2000s. John Gill is the father of modern bouldering. With his revolutionary ideas and techniques, he pioneered a new understanding of what we call bouldering, from the right to move freely in his freedom of expression,
and the responsibility of leading a brand new community of climbers in the right direction. He still remains an influential part of bouldering history today.